such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is a solved one, and it is also a terrifying one about Andrei Chikatilo. This is a serial killer that no one could catch. A man who appeared to be anyone but a killer, but murders that left investigators horrified that this wouldn't stop happening. The public were told nothing about this case until it was solved, and so for 13 years they had to hear through gossip that their community was being traumatized. By the way, I post so much content like this. It is my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if it's something you'd like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed with the post notification bell on, giving this video a thumbs up, and leaving a nice comment down below. I also want to remind you that it is ODDtober, so I'm posting every Thursday and every Sunday at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. So make sure you come back, and if you want to grab any of the merch that I have come out with, I would absolutely love you forever, and I hope that you enjoy the designs that I came up with. I cannot wait to see them on you guys, so send me pictures. Now let's get back to the story. Also, this is a Russian case, so even more than the cases that I have done before, I am going to butcher these names, and as many that I could find, I put in the pronunciations, but there are a lot of actual victim names that I will most likely butcher, and I am very, very sorry. But it was 1981 in Russia, and these horrors would occur in Rostov. Now, Larissa Tachenko was 17 years old and a boarding school student. She had actually gone to the public library, then headed to the bus stop, and that is where she would disappear. She never made it back to school. And the next day, she would be found in the woods in the middle of nowhere. She was covered in leaves and torn pieces of newspaper. She also had mud in her mouth and had been beaten and strangled to death. The worst part was that her body had been mutilated by teeth, and she had been stabbed with an unknown object, and one of her nipples had been torn off as well. Her murder was never solved. And then 9 months later, another would occur. It was June 12th, 1982, and 13-year-old Lyubov Buryuk vanished while walking home from a shopping trip. Now, she was found 15 days later in the woods as well. Lyubov was naked and had been stabbed to death. She had 22 knife wounds found on her head, neck, chest, and pelvic region, but her eyes were also mutilated as well, and she had been sexually assaulted. It was believed from a wound on the back of her head that she had been attacked from behind. But what investigators didn't know at the time was that this was the beginning of a string of many, many more murders. These would be dubbed as the Forest Strip killings. The age of most of the victims ranged from 9 to 18 years old. They could be boys or girls, but they would all be stabbed, slashed, sexually assaulted, and most would have their eyes gouged out or mutilated. They were thought to be bound behind their back with rope and then silenced with mud in their mouths. Another victim was found August 7th. Her name was Lyubov Lalobuvaya, and she was in an orchard near the airport. Then 19-year-old Irina Karabelnikova was found a month later, and the victims just continued from there. It was next 16-year-old Olga Kaprina, and she was found the month after that. It was now October of 1982, and the strangest part of these murders were the fact that the eye sockets were being mutilated along with other random parts of the body. But after this, adult females were also being murdered as well. It wasn't just children. They were often identified as sex workers or members of the homeless community. By December 11th, 10-year-old Olga Shtamekanov was riding the bus home from piano lessons, but would never return. She was found in a cornfield, stabbed 50 times. These murders were all extremely brutal. Her chest was also ripped open, and her uterus had been cut out. This would be the first time that investigators would have a possible suspect, because witnesses on this train had seen a middle-aged man lead this girl away hand in hand. They believed this could have been the killer. Unfortunately, the investigators nor the media were going to ask the public for help in identifying this person because they weren't telling them anything. Instead, they sent out officers both in uniforms and out of uniforms that were undercover to search the area, and with very little to go on, they were pretty much stopping every suspicious man who came by. A 15-year-old had vanished after running away from his own boarding school, but he would be found in January of the next year, which was 1983. His name was Sergei Kuzmin, and he had been stabbed 70 times. Now, investigators had a team of 10 who were working solely on this case known as Operation Forest Path to solve these cases and hopefully stop more from occurring. But that was not going to happen. That June, 15-year-old Laura Sarkeesian was found by an unmarked railway platform. 2 months later, 13-year-old Irina Dunakova was found in a park. They were all found in very secluded areas, but by this point, there were 9 bodies. But only 6 of them could be connected to one another and known to be done by one killer. But this did mean that there was in fact a serial killer terrorizing the community. They could say that for certain. The youngest victim was next, a 7-year-old named Igor Khodov, who was found around the same time. Now, 2 months after that, it was October 8th, an unidentified woman was found as well and believed to be a victim of this serial killer. That same month, on the 30th, a 19-year-old named Vera Shuvkan was found in a mining village, which was also secluded. Although her eyes had not been mutilated like the rest, and in victims to come, not many of their eyes were mutilated either. The next month, Valentina Chuchalina was found at 22 years old, deceased in the woods. But investigators weren't looking for just one man, even though a witness had said he had seen just one man take this girl away. They didn't believe just one human could be doing all of these murders, and they had theorized that a group of people were killing these individuals to harvest their organs or to possibly sacrifice them in a satanic cult. There was also a possibility that a local mental hospital that was nearby had a group of boys who were disturbed, who were killing these people when they were getting away from the home. Because of this theory, investigators were talking to anyone that was in psychiatric wards, on the sex offender registry, and anyone who looked suspicious. They were all interrogated, and if they had an alibi for the last murder that occurred, they were released. Some of these individuals, though, they began to give more than the investigators even could have hoped. Confessions. But this was said to be because investigators were using very harsh and torturous ways of interrogating to get individuals to confess. And for these people who were definitely intellectually disabled and young people, they were more susceptible to confessing even though they hadn't done anything. It was found that most of these suspects who confessed were most likely not involved with the forest strip killings and had just done so because of the interrogation, or because they simply wanted to confess and didn't care if that meant they could possibly go to jail. But there was one good thing that came out of all of these interrogations, and that was that over 1,000 crimes were actually solved because they were talking to people trying to get them to confess their sins, and in fact they did confess a sin, but it just wasn't the forest strip killings. This included 95 murders and a whole bunch of sexual assaults as well. So all of these crimes were solved, but unfortunately this serial killer was still on the loose. And the killings weren't stopping either. It was now 1984, and that January 4th, a Sergei Markov was found after vanishing while heading home from a job. He was only 14 years old. And then a 17-year-old named Natalia Shalapina, she was found around this time, but she had actually been killed 2 years prior and was friends with one of the prior victims. That was the thing, these victims weren't really being found at the same time they were being killed. I am going from when they were found, but a lot of the times they were not found immediately after. That February, Marta Ryabinko was found at the park, and she was 45 years old. She was the oldest victim so far. But then a 24-year-old named Ludmila Kushuba was found March 12th in the woods once again. Later on that month, on the 24th, Dmitry Petskenikova was found as well, and he was actually 10 years old, and once again they knew when he had been kidnapped and by who. He was at a stamp kiosk, and 3 days after this, his body was found, And witnesses then came forward saying they saw him with a man. These witnesses gave sketches of this man who had taken him, but they also found a footprint at Dimitri's crime scene as well as semen and saliva on the victim's clothing. This showed that this person had a type AB blood. Now, 18 murder victims had been found by this point. And now they might just have enough information to bring a serial killer to justice. Yet 2 months later, investigators headed to yet another crime scene, and this time it was of 2 individuals. You see, this was May 25th when 32-year-old Tatiana Personia and her 11-year-old daughter Svetlana were found in the woods together. This was a little bit different than the MO, and a hammer had also been used on the daughter. It was thought that the mother was attacked and the daughter came to look for her and ultimately was killed as well. Next was Dmitry Leronovo, who was 13, who was on his way to the doctor for a checkup, but would never make it. He was going to this checkup to make sure that he was healthy so he could go to camp that summer, and instead he was killed. Next was a 19-year-old named Demi Lemesheva, who was going to the dentist just to get her teeth cleaned when she was killed. These were both in July, and all of these victims were such innocent beings who were just trying to make it in life, who were being offed one by one like they were meaningless. In August, a slew of victims were found. This was 22-year-old Elena Bukalina, Natalia Golosovakia, who was 16, and Ludmila Alexeyevakia, who was 17, Alexander Shepla, who was 11, and they were all found as well in 1 month. Ludmila was missing her upper lip, and Alexander was missing his genitalia. The murders seemed to be escalating as well as the torture, and then that September, 14-year-old Irina Lushenkaya was found in the park as well. You may be thinking, when does this killer get caught? It's been 27 victims. This has to be close to the end, right? Well, it should have been. And it almost was. Just 7 days after the last victim was found, a man was spotted acting very suspicious to young women at the bus station. He looked like he could match the description that was given by witnesses, so he was almost brought in. You see, the officers were watching him, and he didn't look like he was following the girls or hurting them in any way other than harassing them, which is hurting them. But regardless, the officers decided just to follow him and continue to see what he was doing. Then he continued to talk to women. He was touching them very inappropriately, and after watching this happen for so long, the man was finally arrested. Strangely enough, he had a leather briefcase with him, a little bag that had an 8-inch long knife, a rope, and a jar of Vaseline. What investigators believed was a kill kit. Investigators had high hopes that this was the killer, yet they took his blood and he was type A. They needed type AB. This meant he was going to be released on these charges because they couldn't keep him. He didn't match the crime scenes to be the killer. However, when they looked up his name, investigators found that he was also under investigation for minor theft at his last job, and he ended up being sentenced for a year for those crimes. But 3 months later, he was freed instead of having to spend a year. But during those 3 months, another murder didn't occur. This should have been a huge sign that they had the killer. However, the killer had gone months between killing before. There was no set schedule for this MO that made it certain that the killer was in custody and not killing. During the time that this man was in jail, the 6 out of 9 murders that had been connected had turned into 23 that were connected out of 27. But it would be a little over a year after that the killings would begin again. It was now 1985, and a woman would be killed in Moscow. This was a completely different area, but the MO remained the same, and they believed that the same killer did so. After this, Natalia Poshetova was 18, and she was bound, stabbed 38 times, and strangled. Investigators knew that this killer was somehow getting from Rostov to Moscow, and they needed to find out how. So they checked the records of flights during this time to see if, anyone had a criminal record that was on these lists of flights, and they could catch them that way, but nothing was found. Then back in Rostov this same month, another murder victim was found. So they believed the person was back in Rostov. This was 18-year-old Irina Gulovaya, and so this meant that the killer who they were looking for in Moscow now was back in the original killing territory. 5 years of killing 29 known victims, and investigators had failed to keep the public safe. The questionings began again with all of the sex offenders and, mentally disturbed in the area, but they couldn't find any solid leads. Then an undercover search was ongoing with the officers dressed in regular clothes to search the community, the rural areas, to see if they could find anyone suspicious. Female officers were also used as bait to lure the killer into trying to attack them, but nothing worked. So for the first time in Russia, a psychiatrist was brought in to profile the killer. The psychiatrist believed that this killer was a reclusive man between 45 to 50 years old, had an isolated childhood, was incapable of flirting with women. He would also be a sadist with an average intelligence, was likely to be a father, and he was thought to travel for work. The psychiatrist believed that he in fact used trains, which is why some of the victims were found near railway tracks. Yet no more murders occurred for that next year. And it seemed as though the killer being dubbed the Butcher of Rostov, the Four Strip Killer, the Red Ripper, the Rostov Ripper, had moved on or had died. They hoped that he had died, but the more likely theory was that he had moved to a different place after seeing how Moscow was. Now, investigators began warning other investigators in different areas of this killer's MO, that they could possibly be coming to that area, but no one seemed to have heard from him or had seen any victims matching this MO in their areas. Unfortunately, this didn't mean that the killer wasn't killing, and 2 years later, he would be back. An unidentified woman was killed, then 2 young boys, and the next 2 years, the killings ramped up. There was 12 more victims found, meaning that there was 44 in total. And that was just what the investigators knew about. However, they could only connect 34 of them to this certain killer. Most of these victims were found near railway stations, like the psychiatrist had said, but investigators decided to use this to find the killer. They were putting undercover officers at all of the stations, hid cameras were being put on trains, but when this wasn't working, officers were actually placed in uniform at some of the bigger stations so they could push this killer to the smaller ones that were easier to watch. This would be the best choice that investigators made thus far, because the 44th victim investigators knew about would be the final victim. This had happened on November 6, 1990, 9 years after the first murder had been found. That is when a man would be seen coming out of the woods to wash his hands and his face. He appeared to have a smear of blood on his cheek. He had a wound on his finger, and although this man was acting weird, he gave the officer identification, and the officer had nothing to arrest him on, so he let him go. The officer did file a report about him with his name, and 7 days later, a body would be found in those very woods that that man had walked out of. This was 22-year-old Svetlana Korstik. And after this body was found, they knew that they had let a killer go. They searched through all their records and they found this man's name. They brought him in to be questioned, but they quickly realized they had questioned this man before. He was the same man with a bag of strange contents and the type AB blood. This man had also been forced to resign from 2 different teaching positions due to sexual assault of his students. Investigators let him go. They then decided to watch him for 6 days while he talked to young children and women, and finally, they arrested him. His name was Andrei Chikatilo, and he was 54 years old and denying everything. He was not going to confess to the murder no matter what. So investigators tried to have him confess out of disgust for himself, that he was a sick individual who needed help. Basically, they were doing anything possible because in Russia they only had 10 days to either charge him or release him, and they wanted a confession. Andrei then did confess to the assault of his students, but not to the murders, and he was giving officers nothing. So then they brought in a psychiatrist who basically decided to go the route of flattering him, of making him feel superior. Like the psychiatrist wanted to get into his head, wanted to know how he thought, and was intrigued by him rather than disgusted. And that is when 2 hours later, a flattered Andrei confessed to all of the murders. He also at this point burst into tears, but I'm not sure that that was for the victims. I think it was more that he was caught and had to give his secrets away. Investigators told him that they knew that he had killed 34 individuals at least because they had linked them all together. He agreed with this number, going into detail about each of the victims. Andrei said that he would find his targets, he would lure them into secluded areas with candy, goods, or whatever he believed would get them alone. With the adults, he told them that he would pay them for sex. Now, his motive, however, wasn't just to kill. When his victims were dead, he would often sexually assault them. He then mutilated their eyes because he believed a story that he had heard where the image of a murderer would be imprinted upon the eyes after death. But an element of the murders that the investigators were completely unaware of was then revealed. He was also a cannibal. The taste of blood gave Andrei chills, and he enjoyed it. He would tear off body parts with his teeth and run around the bodies holding them. He then graduated to chewing the uterus and testicles and eating the nipples and the tongues. Andrei then informed investigators that there was 22 more victims than they were charging him with, and this was actually 10 more than investigators even knew about, because they knew about more than the 34, but they couldn't link them, but this was 10 more than they even knew about. But most of them had been outside of Rostov. But one was actually prior to what they believed was his first murder. He had killed before then. They were taken to Shakhty, and this was where a shallow grave was found for the first time. A missing 9-year-old named Yelena Zakhtynova had been murdered back in 1978, 3 years before they believed the first murder occurred. Andrei told them that they lured this little girl to his house that he had bought in the middle of the woods that nobody knew about. He choked her and stabbed her, and this made him feel pleasure for the first time in his life. He had gotten away with his murder because another man had been arrested for it. You see, this other man was a criminal, and blood was found in this man's home that matched Yelena's blood type, so they automatically thought he was the killer. He denied it over and over again, but they threatened him. Then he decided to confess, but then he recanted, but he was actually found guilty and executed for this murder that he didn't commit. And investigators knew he didn't commit it because Andrei was now confessing to it. So who was Andrei? What made him a killer? Well, he was born October 16th, 1963 in Ukraine to farm laborers who lived in a one-room hut. They actually worked for no money, but were able to have a tiny place in the back of their hut where they could make their own food to eat. They were often short on food and would eat grass and leaves to keep from starving. His father actually fought in the Second World War and became a prisoner, which meant that when he came home, he was looked down upon for becoming a prisoner. But while his father was gone, Andrei and his mother would often hide in cellars and ditches from shootings and bombings that were happening. And to keep Andrei from running wild, his mother actually told him a story about an older brother he had named Stephen, who had run away from the yard and was kidnapped and eaten at 4 years old by starving neighbors. No one knows if this was the truth or just how his mother kept him in line, but he did remember this story. His mother then had a daughter while his father was at war, meaning that it was not his father's. However, it was known that during this time, a lot of the women were raped by German soldiers, so it's believed that this is what occurred. But since it was a one-room hut, it was also theorized that Andrei had watched this rape occur. But as a teenager, Andrei seemed to be quite normal. He was a top student and graduated, unlike many of his classmates. But he was bullied, and around this time, he discovered his chronic impotence and hated himself for it. He was then not admitted to any of the colleges that he tried for, and he began to go to work to pay for vocational school. He had gotten into a relationship with a girl who broke it off eventually because of their lack of sex life, because he couldn't perform. Andrei then entered the military himself 3 years later and got into another relationship where the girl then told everybody in his small village that he was impotent, meaning that everybody knew, and he was horrified. This was his worst nightmare. So he then tried to take his own life, but his mother did save him, and after this he moved completely away to Rostov. and his family followed shortly after. He then got married, and after many attempts and different techniques, they did have 2 children, a girl and a boy. That's right, this killer was a father. I can't even say the words. He was a father. He went back to school to study Russian literature, and he wanted to become a teacher. That's what he did. The students were said to ignore his rules, that he was pretty much a pushover, and that is when he began to sexually assault multiple of the young girls. Instead of being outed and put in jail, he was just fired, and that meant he could go on to a different school where he assaulted both males and females. This was around the time that he murdered his first victim, and he was eventually fired from that job as well. He claimed he was only able to beat his impotence by stabbing women and children to death, and after his first victim's murder, he had to fight the urge to continue to do so. He said he cut business trips short because he was worried he was going to search for another victim. He went home, tried not to think about it, but 3 years later, he was completely disregarding his ability to choose from right from wrong, and he had a completely secret life with a hidden home and secrets that nobody else could know because he was killing people. He had become a full-fledged serial killer. 56 murders in total was what he confessed to, and by the end of his interrogation, investigators had linked him to 53. 3 of them, they couldn't find the bodies or couldn't find a link to him, but he was then told to reenact how he killed these victims, and he did so with pride. He claimed he never had to look for the victims because they always came to him. A psychiatrist said that Andrei suffered from borderline personality disorder with sadistic features, but was fit to stand trial. He was also thought to suffer from hydrocephalus, or excess fluid that causes the pressure on the brain. Now, of course, we know that any sort of damage to the brain, especially the frontal cortex, can cause empathy and guilt to suffer, meaning that a killer can be born. This is extremely detrimental and could be part of the reason why Andrei was a killer. But the media and public up until this point had no idea who this killer was. They knew one had been caught, but at trial was the first time they saw him, and he was then behind bars in a cage in the courtroom. It was April 14th, 1992, and Andrei began to shout over the judge. He was rambling to himself, singing, exposing himself in the courtroom, all while the trial was trying to occur. He was eventually put back into his cell for part of the trial, and it was believed that he was trying to trick the court into acquitting him due to insanity. When leaving the courtroom, Andrei was actually hit with a chunk of metal by a brother of one of the victims that he killed, and when the security tried to go for the brother to arrest him, all of the other victims' families guarded him and said that they weren't going to arrest him, that he deserved to be able to do that. Andrei did go on to talk to the courtroom, where he said he never meant to kill anybody, but he was plagued by his impotence from birth. He blamed everything on everybody else and never himself. But his insanity act was not believed, and Andrei was sentenced to death plus 86 years. Hearing this, he actually kicked a bench across the cage and began shouting at everybody. Many appeals by Andrei were rejected, and on February 14th, 1994, Andrei was executed by a single gunshot wound behind his right ear. But do you think Andrei was as insane as he tried to show the court, or was that a ploy to get out of killing? I think that he was very good at manipulation, about being two-sided and having this other personality, basically this other side to him that nobody knew about. I think he could turn it on and off, and I think that it wasn't a mental illness as much as it was a way to manipulate people, a way to become the sick individual he wanted to be and do what he wanted to do. But I'd love to know what you think. Do you think that there are more victims out there? I just cannot believe he was a father. That the fact that he went after young victims and was a father, just that part disgusts me the most, I think. I know that this was more serial killer focused than I like to be, but a lot of the victims I couldn't find much information on. Because it is October, I wanted to do a little more serial killers and creepiness, so I hope that that's okay. I did try my best to find all of the victims, but you can find most of their names out there, but not a lot of their pictures. So I did my best, and I hope that's okay with you guys. But do you think it was right to keep this from the public, to keep what was going on, to keep them, calm, or do you think it just led to more panic and theories happening amongst them? I never really know. It's like the worst of two evils, to let them know and have them panic, or to not tell them anything and have a whole bunch of theories and them not know what to look out for. I'm one that likes to be prepared, so I'd be so mad if something was kept from me like that, but I can see why they do it. So remember, it's ODDtober, so come back every Thursday and Sunday, and don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.